A simple woman kicked out of a car dealership. The next day, her billionaire husband showed up. Mistakes have consequences, but some are far more costly than others. At Westfield Motors, a luxury car dealership known for serving the elite, appearances are everything. Salesmen pride themselves on their ability to spot real buyers from the moment they walk through the door. The wealthy and powerful are greeted with warm smiles and eager service, while those who don't look the part are ignored, dismissed, or quietly shown the exit. Then, one afternoon, a woman enters. She doesn't have designer shoes or a flashy handbag. Her clothes are simple, her jewelry modest. She walks with quiet confidence, but to the salesman, she's just another window shopper, someone dreaming beyond her means. They don't see a potential customer, they see a waste of time. So they make a choice. They mock her, laugh at the idea of her affording anything in the showroom. One of them even gestures toward the door, making it clear that she isn't welcome. But they don't know who she really is. The next morning, the truth walks through their doors. A truth so powerful, so undeniable, that it will shake the entire dealership to its core. By the time they realize their mistake, it's too late. Because the woman they turned away wasn't just anyone. She wasn't just another customer browsing on a whim. She wasn't someone they could dismiss with a sneer and a wave of the hand. No, she was something far more important. Someone they should have treated with the respect they so easily reserved for others. But they didn't. They laughed at her, humiliated her, dismissed her like she was nothing. And as she walked out of those glass doors, they didn't spare her another thought. To them, she had been nothing more than an amusing interruption in their day, a joke to be forgotten as soon as the next real customer arrived. But the joke isn't on her, because the next day, someone else walks through those very same doors. And he's not here to browse. He's not here to test drive a car or inquire about the latest models. He's not even here to negotiate. He's here for something else entirely. He's here to make sure they never forget the woman they so carelessly cast aside. And by the time they realize who he is, by the time they feel the weight of their own arrogance crushing down on them, it will be far, far too late. The sun blazed over Westfield Motors, a dealership that only catered to the elite. Inside, sleek sports cars gleamed under the bright showroom lights, each one polished to perfection. Wealthy customers strolled through, dressed in designer suits and expensive jewelry, while salesmen rushed to greet them with eager smiles. Then the glass doors swung open. A woman stepped inside. Emma Lane. She wasn't wearing diamonds or carrying a designer bag. Her outfit was simple yet neat, a comfortable blouse and jeans paired with flats that had seen their fair share of wear. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she carried nothing but a small purse slung over her shoulder. Compared to the usual clientele dripping in wealth and status, she looked ordinary. But Emma Lane was anything but ordinary. She was a woman of quiet strength, someone who had built her life on resilience rather than luxury. Once a hardworking teacher, she had spent years shaping young minds before stepping away to focus on something even more important: family. Despite her simple appearance, she wasn't struggling. She didn't need extravagant jewelry or designer labels to prove her worth. She had everything she could ever want, and more than enough to afford any car in this showroom. Yet today, she wasn't here to flaunt her wealth. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She had come with a purpose. Her husband had been wanting a car from this very dealership for months, an anniversary gift Emma had planned in secret. She had done her research, looked through every model online, and finally, she had decided on the perfect one, a sleek black luxury car that she knew he would love. But this wasn't just about buying a car, it was about him, about them. Daniel wasn't just her husband, he was her best friend, her partner, the one person who had always seen her for who she truly was. They had been through everything together, side by side, never letting life pull them apart. From their early days when they had barely anything to now, when their hard work had finally paid off, nothing between them had changed. She still remembered their first anniversary, when they couldn't afford an expensive dinner. Instead, Daniel had cooked for her in their tiny apartment, using whatever they had in the fridge. It wasn't much, a simple meal, candlelight from an old bedside lamp. But that night, as they sat together, laughing and dreaming about the future, Emma had never felt richer. That was who Daniel was. Thoughtful, loving, the kind of man who noticed the little things, who remembered her favorite songs, who made sure she never felt alone. No matter how busy life got, he always made time for her. He still left notes for her on the kitchen counter, still kissed her forehead when she was half asleep, still held her hand like they were teenagers in love. And she wanted to do something for him, not just any gift, but something special, something he had been wanting for a long time. She had spent weeks planning this moment, imagining the look on his face when she handed him the keys, the way his eyes would light up when he realized she had been listening, that she had remembered, because that was what their love was built on. The small things, the quiet moments, the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures to prove itself. And that was why she had walked into the dealership that day, not as a wealthy customer, not as someone trying to impress anyone, just as a wife wanting to make her husband happy. And yet, in an instant, the salesman had looked at her and decided she wasn't worth their time. They had no idea who she was, and they had no idea what they had just done. And now, standing before it, she let her fingers glide across its polished surface, already imagining the moment he would see it. It was supposed to be a simple purchase. Walk in, sign the paperwork, and surprise the man she loved. But as she admired the car, she failed to notice the way two salesmen nearby had stopped talking. One nudged the other, chuckling under his breath. Their amusement was clear as they exchanged glances, already making their judgment. Because to them, Emma Lane wasn't a serious buyer. To them, she was just another nobody wasting their time. She reached out, fingers grazing the smooth surface, when a voice interrupted. One of the salesmen chuckled, nudging his coworker with an elbow before stepping forward. His name was Ryan Hastings, the senior salesman at Westfield Motors. With over a decade in luxury car sales, he prided himself on his ability to spot real buyers from a mile away. He had built a reputation for closing deals with high-profile clients, CEOs, celebrities, and socialites who could drop millions without blinking. To Ryan, appearances weren't just important, they were everything. And right now, the woman standing in front of the most expensive car in the showroom didn't look like a buyer. Shaking his head, he let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough for his coworker Jake to hear. He glanced at Emma with a smirk, his amusement barely concealed. "Ma'am, do you have any idea how much this car costs?" His tone was dripping with condescension, as if he were explaining something painfully obvious to a child. Emma met his gaze calmly. "I do." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Really? Because I'm pretty sure this beauty right here costs more than your house." Jake snorted, crossing his arms as he leaned against a nearby car. "More than her whole neighborhood, Ryan." His grin widened. "I mean, come on, look at her. You think she's got a few $100,000 just lying around?" The two men laughed, their voices echoing in the grand showroom. A few other employees nearby exchanged amused glances, but none of them stepped in. It was clear. Emma wasn't someone in their eyes. She was a joke. But Emma didn't back down. Her eyes stayed locked on Ryan's, unwavering. "I'd like to test drive it," she said firmly. The laughter only grew. Ryan placed a hand on his hip, shaking his head in disbelief. "Test drive it?" He repeated the words as if they were the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. "Lady, this isn't some used car lot where you take a spin around the block and think about it. Cars like these? You don't test drive them unless you're serious. And you're not serious." Jake nodded in agreement, his grin widening. "She probably wants to post a selfie in it. Look at me, pretending to be rich," he mimicked, holding up a phone, laughing again. Ryan smirked. "Tell you what, if you can afford it, we'll let you drive it. Go ahead, prove me wrong." He held out his hand mockingly. "Credit card? Bank statement? Oh wait, maybe you brought a suitcase full of cash?" Emma reached for her purse, but before she could even open it, Ryan waved his hand dismissively. "You know what? don't bother. We both know you're wasting our time. Why don't you check out something more affordable? He gestured toward the far end of the showroom, where the older, lower-end models were displayed. I'm sure there's something in your price range over there. Jake chuckled. Maybe a keychain. The humiliation was clear. The way they looked at her, the way they spoke, the way they dismissed her without even giving her a chance. It wasn't just rude, it was cruel. Emma tightened her grip on her purse. They had no idea who they were talking to. And tomorrow they were going to regret every single word. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, maybe if you saved up for a few decades you could afford the tires. He turned to a coworker behind the counter. Hey, think we should start charging people just to look at the cars? Maybe $10 a glance? The other employees laughed, and Ryan leaned forward slightly, looking Emma up and down. Tell you what, ma'am, if you can really afford it, why don't you prove it? Go ahead, show me your bank account. Oh wait, let me guess. You don't have that kind of money just lying around, do you? Emma inhaled slowly, willing herself not to react. She had never been the type to flash wealth or demand respect through money. She had lived a simple life before she met her husband, and even now, with more wealth than she could spend, she never saw the need to prove anything to anyone. But standing here, being ridiculed so openly, being treated like she was nothing, made her chest tighten. They had already decided who she was. They had looked at her simple clothes, her modest appearance, and made up their minds. Nothing she said would change that. Jake made a sweeping gesture toward the exit, his smirk widening. Listen, there's the door. Why don't you use it? We're here to sell cars, not entertain people who are just looking. Ryan snickered. Unless you want to take a picture first, go ahead, we'll wait. That way you can post it online and pretend you almost bought it. Another round of laughter. Emma stood still, letting their words wash over her. And then, finally, she spoke. You just lost a sale. Her voice was calm, no anger, no emotion, just a simple truth. Ryan raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Oh no, what a tragedy, he said sarcastically. Guess we'll just have to survive without that imaginary commission. Jake grinned. I'll be sure to tell the boss we missed out on a huge sale today. He's gonna be devastated. The two men burst into laughter again. Emma didn't say another word. She simply turned and walked toward the exit. As the glass doors swung shut behind her, the salesmen had already moved on, turning their attention to a well-dressed couple stepping into the showroom. They didn't look back. They had no idea what they had just done. What do you think will happen next? Those salesmen thought they had won, but they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They mocked her, dismissed her, and sent her away like she was nothing. But the truth? They had just turned away the most important customer they would ever meet. They didn't even spare her a second thought, already shifting their attention to a well-dressed couple who, in their eyes, were the only kind of customers worth serving. They had no idea that their laughter, their arrogance, and their cruelty had just sealed their fate. But the world has a way of setting things right. What happens when the tables turn? What happens when the very woman they humiliated returns, but not in the way they ever expected? Will they realize their mistake before it's too late? Or will they be forced to learn the hard way that judgment, arrogance, and disrespect always come with a price? There's only one way to find out. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. This story is far from over, and trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming. The sun had barely risen when the deep, unmistakable hum of a luxury engine filled the air outside Westfield Motors. A sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to a stop in front of the dealership, its polished exterior reflecting the golden morning light. The valet stationed near the entrance straightened immediately, adjusting his uniform with trembling hands. He knew this car. Before the wheels had even fully settled, he rushed forward, barely suppressing the nervous tremble in his fingers as he reached for the handle. With a smooth motion, he pulled the door open. A single polished dress shoe stepped onto the pavement, followed by the rest of the man. Daniel Lane. Dressed in a tailored black suit, he exuded authority without needing to speak a single word. His presence was commanding, his movements precise. his sharp gaze carrying the weight of a man who was used to being in control. He wasn't just anyone. He was a name that turned heads in every boardroom and financial column. As he stepped inside the dealership, the bustling showroom seemed to pause. Conversations halted. Employees stiffened. Even customers, mid-discussion with their sales representatives, turned their heads toward him. They all recognized him. CEO of Lane Industries, billionaire, automotive mogul, the very man whose name was etched on the luxury brand logos hanging in their showroom. At the front desk, the receptionist sucked in a sharp breath, fumbling with her pen as she whispered to a coworker, "That's Daniel Lane." Across the room, two salesmen stood frozen, the very same ones who had spent the previous day mocking and humiliating his wife. Ryan Hastings felt a cold sweat break out along the back of his neck. His fingers twitched as he instinctively smoothed his hair, forcing himself to stand straighter. Beside him, Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He quickly adjusted his tie, his mind racing to come up with something, anything, to make himself look presentable. Their instincts took over. They hurried forward, past their stunned coworkers, their best salesman smiles plastered onto their faces. "Mr. Lane, what an honor to have you here today," Ryan greeted, his voice a little too eager, a little too forced. "Is there anything we can do for you?" Jake chimed in quickly, his grin wide despite the uncomfortable tightness in his chest. Daniel's expression remained unreadable, but beneath that composed exterior, a storm was brewing. His sharp gaze flicked between the two men, watching the way they straightened their ties and forced their eager smiles. The same men who had laughed at his wife, who had humiliated her just hours ago. Anger burned beneath his calm demeanor, but he refused to let it show. Yet, he had spent years in boardrooms, dealing with men who thought their arrogance made them powerful. He had learned early on that true power wasn't about raising your voice or making a scene. It was about control. And right now, control was the only thing stopping him from tearing these men apart with words alone. He could see the nervous flicker in Jake's eyes, the slight shift in his stance, as if he could sense something was off. Good. Let them squirm. Daniel slowly adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, as if he had all the time in the world. His silence dragged on, thick and suffocating, making the two salesmen fidget under the weight of it. They didn't recognize him. They had no idea who they were standing in front of. But soon enough, they would. His gaze swept slowly across the showroom, taking in the details. Every car, every employee, every sign of nervous movement. Finally, his cold, piercing stare landed on the two men in front of him. His voice was calm, but there was no warmth in it. "I heard this dealership provides exceptional service." Ryan nodded so quickly it almost seemed desperate. "Of course, sir. We cater only to the most distinguished clientele." Jake gave a tight laugh. "We pride ourselves on providing a world-class experience," he added, his hands clasped together like a man trying to secure a deal that was slipping through his fingers. Daniel tilted his head slightly. His voice didn't change, nor did his expression, but the next words he spoke drained the color from their faces. "That's interesting, because yesterday you turned away my wife." Daniel's voice was calm, steady, but beneath it lay something dangerous. A quiet fury that simmered just below the surface, restrained only by sheer will. His wife, the woman who had stood by him through everything, who had believed in him before anyone else did, the woman who had never cared about money or status, who had loved him when he had nothing to his name, the woman who had sacrificed, who had built a life with him, who had been there for every failure and every victory. She was his heart, his home, the one person in this world he would never allow to be disrespected. And these men, these arrogant, small-minded fools, had laughed at her. They had sneered at her, looked down on her, as if she was beneath them. They had mocked the one person he cherished above all else. That was not a mistake. That was an offense. Jake and the other salesmen went pale, their grins fading instantly. They had made the greatest mistake of their careers, and now they knew it. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. the kind that made the air feel too thick to breathe. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, a slow, heavy thud that seemed to echo in the crushing silence. His fingers twitched at his sides as his mind raced, replaying every smug word, every mocking laugh, every dismissive glance he had thrown at Emma just the day before. "That car costs more than your house." The words came back to him like a slap. He had chuckled when he said it, sharing a knowing smirk with Ryan, both of them entertained by their own cruelty. He could still hear the way she had tried to stand her ground, how she had calmly stated that she could afford it. And how had he responded? "We don't waste time on window shoppers." His own voice rang in his ears, now sounding far more arrogant than he had realized in the moment. He had smirked, laughed, gestured to the door like she was nothing but an inconvenience. And she had walked out, humiliated, dismissed, cast aside, like she didn't belong. And now, she belonged more than he ever would. Beside him, Ryan swallowed hard, his mind flashing through the same series of events. He had laughed too, maybe even louder than Jake. He had leaned against a car, watching with smug amusement as they pushed Emma out the door, as if she had no right to be there in the first place. And yet here they were, standing before her husband, a man who was not only wealthy beyond imagination, but someone with power. Power that could ruin them with a single word. Ryan's hands clenched at his sides as cold dread settled deep in his stomach. How could they have been so blind? The silence around them stretched, unbearable now. Jake's tongue felt like sandpaper in his mouth. What were they supposed to say? What excuse could possibly fix what they had done? Because no excuse could erase the truth. They had humiliated the wife of a man who now held their careers in his hands. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if jolted back to reality, Ryan let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Sir, I'm sure there must have been some misunderstanding." Jake quickly nodded, his voice a notch higher than before. We had no idea she was..." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. The manager, who had been watching from a distance, sprinted forward, his own face pale with panic. "Mr. Lane, please, accept our deepest apologies," he stammered, his hands gesturing wildly as if that would undo the situation. If my staff had known..." Daniel wasn't interested in excuses. His voice remained steady, his posture relaxed, but his presence was suffocating. "You judged her by her clothes." The words landed like stones in the pit of Ryan's stomach. "You mocked her." Jake felt his breath shorten. "You humiliated her." Ryan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he couldn't speak, couldn't deny it, couldn't justify it. Because Daniel knew the truth. And now, everyone in the dealership knew it too. Jake licked his lips, his mind scrambling for an explanation, an excuse, anything to salvage the moment. "Sir, we made a mistake." Ryan nodded quickly, the desperation creeping into his voice. "A terrible mistake. We didn't realize who she was." Daniel's gaze remained impassive. He reached into the pocket of his perfectly tailored suit and pulled out a document. Thick, official, important. For a brief second, hope flickered in Ryan's chest. Maybe, just maybe, he could salvage this. Then, Daniel tore the document in half. The sound of paper ripping seemed deafening in the silent dealership. The torn pieces fluttered to the ground. Ryan's stomach dropped. Jake felt his knees weaken. The manager let out a strangled sound, his eyes darting between the shredded contract and Daniel's unmoving face. "I was considering investing millions into this dealership," Daniel stated, his voice still calm, "but I've changed my mind." The silence that followed was crushing. The weight of their mistake fully settled in. Ryan felt an odd numbness creeping into his fingers. A day ago, he had been laughing. A day ago, he had felt untouchable. And now, with one decision, one misjudgment, he had just lost more than he could ever recover. Jake's lips parted, but no words came out. And then, the glass doors swung open once again. All eyes turned, and Emma Lane stepped inside. She wasn't wearing diamonds, she wasn't draped in luxury brands. She looked just as simple as she had yesterday. But now the entire showroom knew exactly who she was. Ryan and Jake went rigid, their shoulders tightening as if the sheer force of her presence had knocked the breath from their lungs. Emma didn't say a word. She simply met their eyes, calm, unwavering. And then, without another glance, she walked past them. Past the men who had laughed at her, past the people who had turned away. She walked straight to Daniel, who placed a hand lightly on her back as they stepped toward the waiting Rolls-Royce. The doors shut behind them. The car pulled away. And inside the dealership, the weight of their biggest mistake hung heavy in the air, a mistake they would never forget. By the time Daniel and Emma Lane's Rolls-Royce Phantom disappeared down the street, the weight of what had just happened settled like a storm cloud over Westfield Motors. The manager stood frozen, his hands trembling as he stared at the shredded contract still scattered across the showroom floor. A document that had once promised millions in investments, now reduced to nothing but torn scraps. Around him, the other employees whispered anxiously, their eyes darting between one another. They knew what this meant. Daniel Lane wasn't just another wealthy client. He was one of the biggest names in the automotive industry. A billionaire mogul who didn't just buy cars, he built empires around them. And now, he had walked out. He had turned his back on them. The silence in the dealership was almost suffocating. Ryan and Jake stood stiffly, their faces pale, their bodies tense, as if they were waiting for the inevitable execution. They had always prided themselves on being Westfield's top salesmen, but right now, their titles meant nothing. The manager finally turned, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "Get in my office, now." Jake swallowed hard. Ryan hesitated for half a second before following quickly behind. Neither of them spoke as they passed the gaping stares of their co-workers. They didn't need to. The weight of their mistake crushed down on them with every step. Jake felt his stomach twist into knots. Just yesterday, he had been laughing, mocking a woman who had done nothing but walk into the dealership with confidence. He had dismissed her without a second thought, treating her like she was insignificant. And now, she wasn't just anybody. She was Daniel Lane's wife. Jake could barely breathe. He had worked in sales for years, priding himself on reading people, knowing which customers were worth his time. But he had been wrong. So wrong that he had cost himself everything. Ryan wasn't any better. His mind raced, replaying the way he had leaned back against the car, smug, arrogant, completely unaware that he was sealing his own fate. His hands clenched into fists as he thought about the way she had looked at them, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. She hadn't fought back, hadn't yelled or caused a scene, and that made it worse. She had simply walked away, leaving them to laugh at their own ignorance. Now, no one was laughing. Ryan's mouth was dry, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. His entire career, his reputation, all of it was about to crumble. The realization was suffocating. They had judged Emma Lane for what she wore, for how simple she looked, for the fact that she didn't fit their narrow idea of wealth. And in doing so, they had insulted the one person they never should have, Daniel Lane's wife. And now they were going to pay for it. They already knew their fate was sealed. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that this was only the beginning. Because Daniel Lane wasn't done. Within hours, a statement rocked the industry. Across every major news outlet, on social media and in press releases, Daniel Lane's announcement spread like wildfire. He was cutting all business ties with Westfield Motors. Every contract, every deal, every single connection they had built with him over the years, erased in an instant. And not just that. He went further. Instead of doing business with Westfield Motors, he was shifting his entire partnership to a competing dealership, one known for treating all customers with fairness and respect. The message was clear, and the consequences were immediate. The fallout came faster than anyone could have predicted. Customers began canceling their orders within hours of the announcement. the dealership's phone lines were flooded, not with new inquiries, but with angry clients demanding refunds. Online, the story exploded. The video footage from the dealership's security cameras, the moment when Ryan and Jake had sneered at Emma Lane, laughed in her face, and dismissed her as a joke, surfaced online. The internet tore them apart. People boycotted Westfield Motors, leaving thousands of furious comments and negative reviews across every platform. The dealership's once polished reputation crumbled under the weight of public outrage. Then came the news stations. Local reporters flocked to the dealership, demanding statements. Paparazzi snapped photos of the empty showroom, the dealership's once lively floors now eerily quiet, as the wave of bad publicity drove customers away in droves. It wasn't long before Westfield Motors' stock plummeted. Investors pulled out, cutting their losses before things got worse. And they did. Because then came the board of directors. Inside the executive boardroom, a storm was brewing. The CEO of Westfield Motors sat at the head of the table, his face twisted in anger as he read the reports flashing across the screen. Profits were crashing. Orders had been slashed. The company's reputation was in shambles. And at the center of it all, two names: Ryan Hastings, Jake Walker, the very salesman who had single-handedly destroyed everything. The decision was swift. By the end of the day, Ryan and Jake were fired on the spot. There was no discussion, no second chances, no exit bonuses. One moment, they had been Westfield Motors' best salesmen. The next, they were nobodies. Ryan stood in the manager's office, his face ashen as he held the termination letter in his hands. The very same hands that had once confidently waved away a potential customer. The wrong customer. Jake sat frozen beside him, his mind racing through everything that had happened, trying to process how quickly they had lost it all. One mistake. That's all it took. One misjudgment. One moment of arrogance. One cruel laugh that had seemed so harmless at the time. And now, they had lost everything. Their careers, their reputations, their futures, all gone in an instant. Westfield Motors wasted no time in cutting them loose. The moment Daniel Lane left the dealership, the manager called them into his office. There was no negotiation, no second chances. The humiliation they had put Emma through had cost the dealership its most valuable partnership, and someone had to take the fall. That someone was them. Jake had tried to argue, his voice hoarse and desperate, saying it had been a misunderstanding. Ryan had begged, insisting they would do better, but it didn't matter. The decision had been made. They were fired on the spot. Their names spread online within hours. Social media exploded with the news. The story of two arrogant salesmen who had judged a woman by her clothes, mocked her, and lost everything when her husband... The internet had no mercy. Comments flooded in. They deserved it. How could they treat someone like that? I'll never buy from Westfield Motors again. Karma at its finest. Jake tried to apply for another job the very next day. No one would hire him. Every dealership he called already knew who he was. His name was ruined. Ryan wasn't any luckier. His inbox filled with rejection emails. His phone calls went unanswered. Even places that weren't in the luxury car business wanted nothing to do with him. The weight of their mistakes sank in like a stone in their chests. One bad decision, one cruel moment, and now they were nobodies. And as they stepped out of the dealership for the last time, their once proud suits now feeling far too heavy, they saw something that made the humiliation even worse. Across the street, at the rival dealership Daniel Lane had now partnered with, the showroom was packed with customers. The very people who had once trusted Westfield Motors had moved on, just like Daniel Lane had, and there was nothing they could do about it. Westfield Motors never recovered. The damage had been done. The lesson was clear. Respect should be given to everyone, not just those who look wealthy. Because in the end, arrogance is expensive. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma and Daniel arrived at Rivermount Luxury Motors, the dealership Daniel had chosen to support instead. Unlike the cold, dismissive treatment she had faced at Westfield Motors, this place felt different from the moment she stepped inside. The staff didn't hesitate, didn't judge. They welcomed her with warmth and professionalism. Salesmen smiled genuinely, greeting her as they would any valued customer, not based on what she wore, but for who she was. One of them, a polite young man in a crisp navy suit, approached with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Lane," he said, offering a set of polished keys in his outstretched hand. "Your car is ready." Emma took the keys, her fingers brushing over the cool metal. She let the moment settle, feeling the stark contrast between today and the humiliation of the day before. Here, she wasn't being dismissed. She wasn't being laughed at. She was respected. A quiet satisfaction settled in her chest as she turned toward the sleek, black luxury sedan parked just outside under the dealership's glowing lights. It was the same model she had admired yesterday, only this time, there was no mockery, no sneering comments, only recognition of her worth. As she approached the car, Daniel watched from a few steps away, his gaze steady. He had never needed to prove anything to anyone. His success spoke for itself. But today wasn't about business. It wasn't about power. It was about something far more important: respect. Emma slid into the driver's seat, the scent of new leather wrapping around her. The engine purred to life beneath her touch, and for a moment, she simply breathed it in. Then, with one last glance toward Daniel, who gave her a small, knowing nod, she pulled out of the lot, the car gliding smoothly onto the road. Daniel stood watching, his expression filled with quiet pride. She had walked into that dealership yesterday as an easy target for judgment. Today, she drove away as someone no one would ever underestimate again. Because in the end, the truth was clear. No one should ever be judged by their appearance. Jake and Ryan's downfall was swift and merciless. The moment Daniel Lane's statement went public, the internet erupted. Customers shared their own experiences of being judged by salespeople, and soon the story spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, influencers weighed in, Westfield Motors became a cautionary tale. But the ones who suffered most were Jake and Ryan. Their faces were everywhere. Screenshots from security footage, angry comments calling them out by name, endless posts demanding accountability. People flooded the dealership's page with bad reviews, calling them rude, arrogant, and unprofessional. Within hours, both of them were fired. And it didn't stop there. Jake had been in sales for years, always confident that if he lost one job, he could find another. But now, every dealership in the area had seen the story. Every interview ended the same: polite smiles, empty promises, and a quiet rejection. No one wanted to hire someone whose name was tied to a scandal. Ryan fared no better. He reached out to old colleagues, hoping for a recommendation, but no one wanted to be associated with him. His inbox remained empty. His phone stopped ringing. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be dismissed without a second thought. Weeks passed, and the two of them hit rock bottom. The anger and denial faded, replaced by something heavier: regret. They replayed that moment in their minds over and over again, thinking about what they could have done differently. If only they had treated Emma with respect. If only they had listened instead of laughing. One evening, after another failed job interview, Jake turned to Ryan and sighed. "We need to make this right." They both knew what they had to do. The next morning, they stood outside Daniel Lane's company headquarters, clutching an envelope containing a handwritten letter. They weren't expecting anything. They just wanted to apologize. When they were finally led into an office, it wasn't Daniel who greeted them. It was Emma. She sat behind the desk, hands folded neatly, watching them with a quiet, unreadable expression. Ryan's throat tightened. She had every reason to turn them away. Every reason to ignore them the way they had ignored her. But instead, she was listening. "We're sorry," Jake said, his voice thick with guilt. "We were wrong. We judged you without knowing anything about you, and we lost everything because of it." Emma was silent for a moment, then let out a soft sigh. "I forgive you." Emma was silent for a moment, then let out a soft sigh. I forgive you? The words left her lips effortlessly, but the weight behind them was not light. She could see the disbelief in Jake and Ryan's eyes, the way they had expected anger, resentment, maybe even satisfaction at seeing them struggle. But that wasn't who she was. Emma had never been the type to hold on to bitterness. She knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be treated as if she was less than just because of how she looked. It had happened before, at restaurants, at boutiques, in places where people assumed wealth had a uniform, and kindness was reserved only for those who looked the part. She could have let their cruelty fester inside her, turning into something ugly. But what would that accomplish? Hatred only bred more hatred. Besides, she wasn't forgiving them for their sake. She was doing it for herself. She had everything she needed: a loving husband, a life built on hard work and integrity, and the knowledge that, in the end, she had proven them wrong without ever having to stoop to their level. That was enough. But forgiveness didn't mean there were no consequences. Her expression remained calm as she looked at them. I hope you've learned something from this, she added gently. Because not everyone you meet will give you a second chance. Their eyes flickered with regret, the full weight of her words sinking in. Emma didn't need revenge. She had already won. Ryan blinked, his jaw slightly open. Just like that? Emma nodded. Holding on to anger only hurts me too. For the first time in weeks, a weight lifted from their shoulders. But then she leaned forward, her expression firm. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. They both swallowed hard. Emma continued, You weren't punished because of who I'm married to. You were punished because you treated a customer unfairly, and that's something you needed to learn. Jake and Ryan nodded slowly. They understood now. They had spent their careers judging people by appearances, believing that wealth looked a certain way. But they had been wrong, and it had cost them everything. As they left the office, they knew they had a long road ahead. They would have to rebuild their reputations from scratch. But this time, they would do it right. Because in the end, they had learned a lesson they would never forget. Respect should be given to everyone, not just those who look wealthy. This story serves as a powerful reminder. Respect costs nothing, but losing it can cost everything. Too often, people judge others based on what they wear, what they drive, or how much money they appear to have. But true worth isn't found in designer clothes or luxury cars. It's found in character, integrity, and how we treat others. The salesman at Westfield Motors thought they could look down on someone just because she didn't fit their idea of a wealthy customer. They laughed at her, mocked her, and pushed her aside, all because of an assumption. But in the end, it wasn't Emma who left empty-handed. They did. They lost more than just a sale. They lost their jobs, their dealership's reputation, and the trust of customers who once walked through their doors. Because when respect is given only to those who seem important, it isn't respect at all. It's arrogance. Let this be a lesson to all of us. Never judge a person by their appearance. The kind stranger, the quiet customer, the person others ignore, they might be more important than you think. So the next time you meet someone, treat them with kindness. Offer them respect, not because of what they have, but because it's the right thing to do. Because in the end, money fades, power shifts, and appearances change, but respect lasts. If you enjoyed this story and believe in treating people with kindness, subscribe for more inspiring stories. Let's spread the message that true worth isn't measured by wealth, but by how we treat one another.